Hello, hello, welcome everyone. We're just letting people come into the room and David will start us off. We'll give it another minute and then we'll begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a critical mass. So my name is David Garcia. I'm the policy director at the Terner Center, and I have the pleasure of kicking off today's conversation about the 2023 legislative session. As if you're tuning in, you probably already know that the Terner Center does a lot of work around policy ideas and a lot of work specific to California. For example, we did some work just earlier this year looking at the impact of Senate Bill 35 and the implications for extending that piece of legislation as proposed through Senate Bill 423. So first of all, thanks to the Hilton Foundation for their work supporting our look at various California policies. But today we're here to talk about not just the impact of previous policies, but what's actually been enacted this year. It was a very active year in the legislature, as we will hear in just a moment. Again, I'm just here to welcome you and to thank everyone for. If you are new to the Terner Center, please feel free to visit us at turnercenter.berkeley.edu. And we'll have more information throughout the session on our work and our engagement on legislative issues. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mohammed, who is going to introduce today's panel and going into a brief presentation. So Mohammed, please take it away.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for the introduction, David. First we'll start with just a presentation. I'll introduce each of the panelists. This is the order that I'm going to introduce each person. Everyone welcome Mahdi Manji. He is the Policy Director of the Inner City Law Center. ICLC advocates for land use policies to increase the production of affordable housing, increase the revenue for affordable housing, end segregationary residential patterns, and keep people in their homes while protecting the rights of all the housed and unhoused in Los Angeles. Next with me is Marina Wiant. She is the VP of Government Affairs at the California Housing Consortium. CHCC is an advocacy organization focused on the production and preservation of housing affordable to low and moderate income Californians. CHC has sponsored several critical pieces of legislation to expand state funding and reduce barriers for affordable housing production, including co-sponsoring SB 423 and AB 2011, and sponsoring legislation to expand the density bonus provisions and CEQA exemptions for 100% affordable housing, and co-leading Props 1 and 2 housing bond campaigns. Next up is Michael Lane, State Policy Director for SPUR, who has an extensive background in housing development, public policy, legislation, politics, and campaigns. He has worked in local government and held elected office as a school board member and city council member. Finally, let me introduce Cornelious Burke, who serves as California Builders, I didn't do the acronym, Industry Association's Vice President of Legislative Affairs. In this role, he advocates for CBIA before the California State Legislature, Governor's Office, and state agencies to advance the policy goals of the home building industry and to increase home ownership opportunities. He is also an experienced urban planner and government relations strategist. Everyone welcome our panel. Now, I'll ask each of you to go off video just momentarily, just so I could catch everyone up of what's been going on in California's legislative session before we ask questions. Thank you. So this has been an interesting year in California. About 60 bills are now sitting on the governor's desk that relate to housing. There were some themes that we've been seeing throughout the legislative session this year. First, it's the affordable housing moderate income streamlining bills. The first one would be Senate Bill 4, which streamlines affordable housing on lands owned by faith-based organizations and nonprofit institutions of higher education. The Terner Center released a paper about a month and a half ago on Senate Bill 4, finding that about 171,000 acres in California are eligible for affordable housing production. The lot sizes are such that they can actually fit affordable housing projects. This isn't a definite, like, this will be developed, but this is a possibility. Next will be Senate Bill 423, which extends and expands the applicability of Senate Bill 35. If you want to learn more about Senate Bill 35, we released a paper about a month and a half, 2 months ago on its effectiveness between the years of 2018 to 2021. We found that at least 18,000 units are in the process of being permitted and being built. Over 70% of them are affordable housing. SB 423 expands upon SB 35, making it eligible in the California coastal zone and created new labor standards. Next, we saw AB 1287, which expands the state density bonus for an additional bonus for moderate income housing. This builds upon a program that we found in San Diego, where if you were to max out extremely low income, or housing units, that you could have an additional density for moderate income housing, which is affordable up to 120% AMI. Finally, when it comes to affordable and moderate income streamlined housing, we see SB 684 by Caballero, which fast tracks the subdivision process on multifamily zones, where subdivisions could happen up to 10 subdivisions on a parcel. There are more bills that aren't listed in this PowerPoint and throughout this PowerPoint, actually. So feel free to read our research paper, which was released just this morning, to learn more about the 60 housing bills that have been passed in California. I couldn't cover all 60, but I did the best I could. Next slide. We also see this continuation of CEQA modifications and housing enforcement. In response to a California court decision on student noise and impacts on neighborhoods in the Berkeley area, Assemblymember Wicks introduced a legislation that would not allow courts to consider the noise of students or visitors to be a significant environmental impact under CEQA. We continue with CEQA streamlining, where 100% affordable housing are exempt from CEQA review. There are some caveats on that, which I recommend reading the paper. We also find a huge strengthening of enforcement. First with AB 434, which increases the enforcement of certain laws, including Senate Bill 9 or SB 35. Senate Bill 9, AB 2011. A couple of ADU laws that you should see within the research paper, because now HCD could cause enforcement for a lot of housing laws that have been passed. And finally, HCD and the Attorney General have the unconditional right to represent the state in any legal action regarding housing laws that are set by local governments. Next slide. And then we find some more bills when it comes to tenants, parking, and more. We couldn't fit everything within a 5-minute PowerPoint presentation here today, but we find bills that are expanding housing support services for people that are eligible for Medi-Cal. This is similar to a process that we see in 15 other states that allow housing to be a part of the supportive services done by Medi-Cal benefits. We find a bill that allows a limit on security deposits for certain apartments, and 2 parking bills. One that owners must unbundle the parking when it comes to the price of rent in certain residential properties, and also that developers could count underutilized lots through agreements to fulfill their parking requirements. Next slide. And we continue on with accessory dwelling units, actually, one of the most successful housing production programs in the state of California. There was a bill introduced that has local governments to create pre-approved plans for ADUs or provide a list of entities with pre-approved ADU designs that homeowners could use. This is very similar to a program that has been available in San Jose and a few other cities across the state. Now it's happening statewide. AB 976 ends the owner occupancy requirement for ADUs, and AB 1033 allows local governments to opt in to allow ADUs to be sold separately from a primary residence. Next slide. So the governor has the governor has 4 more days to sign or veto these bills. If the governor doesn't sign the bill, there are over 1,000 bills on his desk right now. They just automatically become law. This March, we expect a $6.4 billion bond to fund new mental health treatment services and permanent supportive housing across the state. And there will also be a change when it comes to the millionaire's tax in California to support ongoing services through this bond. We also expect ACA 1 and SCA 2 to happen in November. If you want to read, I'm just running out of time, I'm so sorry. If you want to read more about these bills, they're coming to you in the November ballot in 2024. Check out our research paper. There are bills that have been paused. This is a 2-year cycle, so bills can be reintroduced next year, and especially ballot measures. So we have the Affordable Housing Bond of 2024, which is a $10 billion bond for affordable rental housing and homeownership programs, and also the Community College Public Education Facilities Bond, which will fund schools and school facilities so local governments don't have to opt in for higher impact fees for new developments. Next slide. Thank you so much. Scan the QR code to sign up for our monthly newsletter. And now I will begin our panel discussion. Feel free to add questions to the Q&A box at the bottom, and use the Q&A feature, not the chat, please. Welcome, panelists. And if everyone could be just off mute just for this conversation, unless you have background noise. Tried my best to cover all the bills that you have all helped pass this last year, and it was a very valiant effort, but I am a little bit behind time, but now we have a lot of time that we can allocate for y'all to answer the big questions, like my most pressing one. Each of you have to answer this. Do you feel like this was a big year in housing, or was it a little lackluster? I feel like each of you have different positions and represent different sectors and have different responses for this.
You want me to go first?
Go ahead, Marina.
I think this was a medium year for housing. I think, you know, we talked about this a lot, but there's not really a silver bullet to solve the housing crisis. We have many, many reasons for why California is in the position it is in today related to housing. And so again, I think what's interesting about this year is combined, if you look at the huge sort of mass of bills, I think together they make an impact. Some of them a pretty significant impact. But it wasn't a year where I felt like there was this very clear, like, this is the one bill that is the high profile, going to solve everything bill, which, and again, I don't think there's ever really a bill that does that either, you know? So I'd say medium year, and excited for like what might come and what is still pending, both for the governor's signature and also for 2024 ballot.
I would concur. This is Cornelious with the California Building Industry Association, representing California's home builders. It was a medium year, but a very successful year for CBIA. Unfortunately, we spent a lot of our time and energy at the state capitol this year fighting bills that add cost, complexity, and delays to building more housing in our state. And overall, we were very successful in defeating a lot of bad bills that would have made the housing crisis even worse.
I have to agree with Marina here. I think it was a medium year, a moderate year, so to speak. I think some very significant bills that will make affordable housing and mixed income housing possible passed, and hopefully will receive the governor's signature. We're very proud to sponsor Senate Bill 4 and 423. At the same time, it was a year where we saw sort of provisions relating to single family housing stripped from SB 684. And we did see this continued, I think, struggle that we are facing in California between the desire to resolve our housing crisis and the desire to maintain our status quo housing crisis. I would also add, I think this was a year where we again saw lack of willingness, difficulty in allocating significant amounts of funding for affordable housing. And of course, there were budgetary constraints this year that contribute to that. But we know we all need a significant amount of dedicated revenue for affordable housing, and we didn't see that this year.
So I'll go ahead and be the outlier and say it was a big year for housing, and I'll explain myself and defend myself.
Do it.
Yeah, but I really think that we've really accomplished a lot as a coalition. Our coalition has evolved. I just want to give a shout out to those who worked, for example, on SB4, which was that had been introduced 3 times, and it just talks about the perseverance of that and working hard. And the same thing with ACA1 and lowering that voter threshold that had been introduced 3 times. But over time, we built this coalition and including our California Home Building Alliance, which is an informal coalition of organizations and advocates across the state, really focused on pro-housing production. I certainly agree there could have been more done through the budget for affordable housing funding. On the one hand, on the other hand, I think we worked very closely with our chairs over the past couple of years. I think to get that extension and that expansion of SB 423, including into the coastal zone, was a really big deal. And I think it was our coalition that coming together and working with our sponsors of those bills, like Marina and Mahdi, that really, I think, has demonstrated what we can do going forward. So I want to go ahead and say, based on kind of a historical perspective, I guess, which just means I'm kind of old, that it really was a very successful year, and to get SB 35 extended for a decade is a really big deal.
And, I think an interesting point too, and thank you, Michael, for raising the fact that there are several bills that did pass this year that have taken years to go to move, like 1633 and SB4 and ACA1. But I think we came into this year at CHC kind of with somewhat low expectations too. We had many new members of the legislature. We weren't sure kind of like how the politics was going to fall with a lot of that. So considering kind of what we thought this year, we thought this was going to be like a rebuild year of really getting to know and grooming a lot of new members and kind of rebuilding the bench of housing advocates in the legislature. And it proved that, we actually had a lot of allies, and maybe more than we had anticipated, and were able to take advantage of that too, to lead to a medium to great year for housing.
Are there any favorite bills that you have that didn't get a lot of attention from the public that you feel like the audience should know about? Like any silent game changers?
Two bills I want to mention here. AB 1418, I think is a very, very important bill, which will reduce significant barriers for people with criminal backgrounds to access housing and outlaw the enforcement of crime-free housing ordinances at the local level. We've seen these ordinances, really being used to discriminate against Black and brown folks and anybody with a criminal background. And so we're really excited that AB 1418 was passed. Another bill, which we didn't mention at the start, I feel was SB 567, which is a bill that strengthens the Tenant Protections Act and ensures that various provisions of the Tenant Protection Act will be able to be enforced. And so really excited about both of those bills and glad the governor signed both of those bills.
For us at CBIA, a really important bill is actually one of our sponsor bills this year is SB 405. And interesting enough, it was actually based upon the great research of the Terner Center. And this bill seeks to really improve how we use housing elements to make sure that the sites that are listed on the housing elements are real viable sites. They will be developed. No more paper sites. So no more sites that would never be developed as housing is now getting counted for housing. So we were very excited to introduce that bill authored by Senator Cortese of San Jose, but unfortunately it did die in the Senate Appropriations Committee. We will be working in the fall to really kind of redo the bill, redevelop it, and hopefully introduce it again next year. But just to see the fact that we're making some great improvements on housing elements is a good start to really address our housing needs and also make sure we do real planning. While, we share a lot about bills that we're able to push to the governor's desk and get signed into law, for us at CBI, we're actually really excited that we're able to defeat a lot of bad bills. So AB 68 is very problematic to our industry and housing production overall. We're very excited that bill will stop this year, and also bills like AB 1000, which seeks to limit warehouse production as we talk about mixed use and linking jobs and housing together. We're really excited to see that bill be defeated as well. So a lot of bills that we were able to defeat that we're excited about.
No, Cornelious, that's a little unfair. I got to have the co-sponsors of those bills to bicker with you about this, right? Because they don't see it as housing killers, but that's the policy space. There were a bunch of people that want to be on this panel, but I couldn't field that many people, right?
We had a sleeper bill too that I'm really excited about, SB 439 by Senator Skinner. And so, what we've seen in the affordable housing space is many projects that are 100% affordable already qualify for CEQA exemptions, various streamlining or other expedited by right approvals. But that doesn't solve the problem if you have a very well-funded opposition that can still drag you into never-ending litigation. And so one of the things we really wanted to try to shut down is how do we get rid of some of these meritless lawsuits earlier? Because as you know, if an affordable developer is stuck in litigation for 3 years, for example, that alone might kill the project that had already been approved. So SB 439 creates a new special motion to strike for these projects. Where once a plaintiff files a lawsuit to try to block an approved affordable housing project, the defendant can file this motion and force the plaintiff to, at the very outset, make a showing that they are likely to succeed on the merits of the case. So it really turns the case around very quickly. And if a judge finds that there's no merit and this is frivolous lawsuit, they can dismiss the case right at the beginning within the first 60 days of the suit being filed. And this is for any type of suit that is challenging an approved project. It includes CEQA challenges, but even if someone's trying to use SB 35, is granted SB 35 approval, for example, and then is facing a legal challenge in court, this could be used.
Great.
Wow.
I would just jump into, I wanted to say for us, it would be AB 1633, certainly with Assemblymember Philtang, and appreciate everyone's support for that. But the court of bad faith calls for additional environmental review as a way to deny or delay approval of a project. That was really important. Worked on that for a couple of years now, including with local governments to get it right. It's on the governor's desk. We also did work on a moderate income density bonus that builds on top of the existing affordable requirements for density bonus. And then we did some parking reforms, once again, that require local jurisdictions to allow a new development or existing developments to utilize shared parking if you can demonstrate that it's being underutilized near the project. So continue to make progress on those, and we'll have more updates on our SPUR.org website, particularly after the governor signs those bills, to give a sense of where they ended up toward the end of the session in terms of the language. But we think those will be very powerful.
Nice. Okay, definitely. And I have some follow-up questions for all of you about specific details of all these bills, but we need to continue. So there has been a lot of turnover in the legislature, about I think 35 new legislators just this year, and many prominent housing forward legislators are coming up to their term limit. So how do you each see housing legislation evolving as we welcome in new members, and also this change in leadership, right? We have a new speaker, we have a new pro tem this year.
I would just say it's an ongoing process with new members to really engage, and our coalition really works hard on that, because you can't take anything for granted. There's still lots of opposition to housing, as you know, at the local level. and backlash about what's happening at the state level even. And so you want to make sure you're getting in there. And a lot of those members who are elected have come from local governments, and we can, find commonalities and we can talk to them. And some organizations, not SPUR, we're 501c3, but others have C4s now, and they're endorsing candidates. They have PACs and they're making contributions. So that's really changed the dynamic, as well as just the YIMBY movement too at the grassroots level. I think getting in there and showing up at the planning commissions and city councils and overcoming a lot of that opposition, I think that sends a very positive message. But we still need to do the work as the members come to the state level and give them some of that institutional memory that we have and the historical understanding of how the bills have developed and how effective they've been. Particularly, I just want to commend Terner for your work, because that's really important for the legislature too. And what we all try to do, I think, on this call is to bring data and facts to which is also something I think relatively new in the housing space in terms of advocacy, because that really helps ground the conversations that we're having and actually makes the legislation better.
And, for almost every day, when you come to Sacramento, what is the biggest thing your constituents tell you to work on? Housing. It is number 1, number 2, number 3. So that's what we're starting to see more and more. That is the biggest issue in the state capitals. How do we address our state's housing crisis? That's the mandate they're getting from their constituents when they come here.
Yeah, I'll say I'm cautiously optimistic about sort of all this new turnover. We're excited to work with the new pro tem. We're excited to work with the new speaker. I do think, Cornelious has raised an important point. Housing is the most important issue that every candidate, when they're running for office right now, for assembly, for Senate, that's what they're hearing from their constituents is we need to find a way to house folks who are homeless, and we need to address the housing affordability crisis. And so I think that the fact that legislatures members are coming to the House, to the Assembly, to the Senate with that priority in mind, that I think is just that is very important. And I think with the new generation, there's a greater degree of flexibility and a recognition that the way we've been doing things, the current status quo is not working. There's always a reluctance to limit local control, but I think I'm optimistic with this new generation of legislators. There's a recognition that we are where we are for a reason, and the state has to make efforts to make housing more, easier to build.
I would echo what everyone's shared already, and just want to lift up to the incredible role that the speaker had. The previous Speaker Emeritus Rundin had in moving AB 2011 and really pushing a breakthrough between some of the tensions and what is the appropriate labor standard for a lot of housing legislation. And absent that leadership, we wouldn't quite have been able to have the momentum that we've had the last 2 years. And then, I'm really looking forward to seeing how the new speaker does as well. He's a huge housing champion already. And he really helped push ACA 1 through as well, which was a real testament to his leadership there. Since that bill, again, it took, I think, 5 introductions to even get a vote. Yes, some would say housing hero. And so, I think that's huge. And, we'll see the incoming pro tem, I think, is part of sort of the existing pro tem's leadership style to sort of continuing that. And so I hope that he supports housing the way pro tem Atkins has over her tenure. But again, there will be challenges, I think, over the next 18 months to make sure that we keep housing production going in all corners of the state.
Yeah. I will ask you all the same question in private, because I feel like the responses will get a lot more nuanced. I love that response. And now that we're talking about, the funding for affordable housing, the funding for housing production, streamlining, these sort of things, we have multiple bond measures and propositions and a budget deficit coming into the housing space next year. How do you all feel? How do you feel like this will actually morph the housing conversation differently from what we've seen before?
I just think it all comes down to voter sentiment, of course, and that is driven by the economy in large part. And so we got to keep an eye on that. so far the state budget has held together, although there'll still be something of a deficit. I think it's projected at 10 billion at this point based on the revenues that have been coming in. But that's going to be very important in terms of the polling. Whatever goes before voters, it really needs to be well thought out. I know the legislature is being very thoughtful about what they plan to put on the ballot, including, I know, and Cornelious want to talk about the school facilities bond as well, which is important for housing too, because school impact fees can be significant as well. But we need to be very thoughtful about what we put on the ballot, going forward. And obviously interest rates and the cost of construction are ongoing concerns that we're going to have to continue to address and demonstrate the value that we can deliver for those public dollars. But we do expect to see a statewide, housing bond in November, and also regional measures as well that are being proposed. But once again, making sure that we're hitting those messages and demonstrating what we can provide, with those public investments.
Two things, one, in terms of the state budget, interesting enough, a lot of talk on housing this year, but not specifically on home ownership. And one thing we're definitely watching next year is the California Dream for All program, and that's the innovative down payment assistance program that was severely underfunded just given the state's budget conditions. So interesting enough to see how much money is allocated to that next year. Also, number two, as Michael talked about, for us at CBIA, we worked really hard to support AB 247, which is the K through 14 school bond. We really need a $14 billion school bond on the statewide ballot in 2024. It's critical because the way we modernize existing schools and construct new schools is a three-part formula: home builder fees, local district fees, and the state portion. And the state gets their portion through the passage of a school bond periodically. And absent the passage of a school bond, you get higher impact fees and pretty much a moratorium on middle-class housing. So it's really interconnected, the school facilities, bond, and housing production. So we definitely encourage everyone to support a school bond when it's on the ballot in 2024.
Cornelious, do you have an estimate of how much bigger these school impact fees will be if the bond doesn't pass?
It depends on the district you're in, but it could be thousands of dollars, which will price out a lot of families and also make a lot of projects not cancel on.
Thank you.
I think, there's something, I'm going to touch on something and probably people are going to disagree, or you could have a whole conversation about this, but there's something definitely wrong with California's tax system when we can have such a surplus 3 years ago and then have a deficit today. And, that touches on a lot of other issues and a lot of third rail issues in the state too, that probably we don't have time to talk about today. But it's disappointing to me to see in 2023, 2024, us having to go and get a housing bond, for example, when what we really need to be doing is regularly funding affordable housing production annually, so that we don't have these boom and busts, and in particular, so that we can be building deed restricted affordable housing when the market rate housing slows down. Countercyclical investment is key. And we really made that argument back in 2020 during the surplus years. And I don't want to scoff at the funding that we got. It was significant at the time. But we really were pushing for more funding to sort of pre-fund the programs that we knew were going to be out of money in a couple of years. And so it's too bad we weren't able to kind of do more with the money, the COVID relief dollars in 2020, and to be able to, again, use it to fund construction down the road, because it is a tough time to go to voters and ask for more general obligation bonds, especially when interest rates are so high, right? And so and in the housing space, and it's a little bit different, I think, for school construction, but for affordable housing construction, we don't need billions of dollars at one time. We need consistent amounts of money over time. I don't need $14 billion today. I need $2 billion every year. And so it's frustrating when we do have to then kind of circumvent that process, and we don't have general fund dollars really going to housing production, or at least not very much on an annual basis in the state, where housing is such a critical need.
Yeah, and second, Marina, to your point, we didn't get to this crisis by, by spurts, right? We had a consistent decline in production of affordable housing, consistent decline in revenue for affordable housing, and to really move out of this housing crisis, to move out of this homelessness crisis, we need consistent ongoing funding for affordable housing, consistent ongoing funding for permanent supportive housing, and it needs to be every single year. It needs to grow as the need grows. It needs to be countercyclical. I do think a housing bond, of course, is good, but the fact that it needs to be done is a problem, right? We're using a mechanism to generate one-time funds that have to be repaid over 30 to 40 years for something that should be ongoing funding. I do think ACA 1, reducing the threshold for local affordable housing to 55% is a positive move. Hopefully that will pass. There are also some concerning propositions that we potentially face in this ballot. Want to mention two of them. Obviously, we have a potential ballot measure to, repeal most state housing element law and block the enforcement of housing elements and whatnot. That I think is very concerning. It would make all of the efforts that we've passed in recent years meaningless. So that's a very dangerous place. I want to add there's another ballot measure which would significantly increase the barriers for citizens to initiate tax measures and revenue for affordable housing and for every other government purpose. So I think that is concerning as well. We need to make it, in a democratic society, the majority of people should be able to approve taxes to fund the needs of our society.
And I couldn't agree more. We definitely need a robust conversation about the state's tax policy and regulatory environment, particularly how it impacts housing production. We should definitely fund affordable housing ongoing through the general fund or some broad-based funding stream. But too often, it's on the back of housing production. I mean, when you say, hey, you know what? I have a new app. I have a new lemonade stand. It's like, great, you started a business. Good for you. You say you want to build a house? Oh, look, all these regulations and fees and taxes you have to pay. Then we scratch our head and say, why haven't we produced enough housing? We should look at ways to remove the barriers, to incentivize housing production. Maybe look at tax credits, remove all the regulatory barriers, and so we can produce as much housing as necessary. So yes, I couldn't agree more with Marina. Maybe we should even call a special session on regulations and taxes as it impacts housing production. We really think about some really important legislation to push to remove these barriers to housing production. And look at, of course, ongoing funding for affordable housing, but not on the back of housing production, of course.
Would BIA support tax increases in other areas as long as if it was going to support more housing? Because I think that's where the tension is, right? Like when we want to have these conversations, it ultimately means you are going to have to increase taxes elsewhere. And, what does that look like? What does that mean?
That's something we have to discuss because obviously our taxes in our state are very high. We have one of the highest corporate taxes in the country. We have some of the highest cost of living in the country. So we have to think about the people who are paying these taxes and fees as well.
I think also this comes back to the discussion of Prop 13, which we do not have enough time to talk about on the third row in the discussion. I also want to bring up a point that we talk about the state budget, and we never really focus on the allocation of federal money when it comes to affordable housing production and how that's been a barrier, right? Like California is just trying to finance it itself, but we have this whole federal government that hasn't really increased funding as much as necessary for us to solve this crisis, correct?
Yeah, and we've been pushing for some pretty key changes at the federal level for the federal low-income housing tax credit program at a minimum, because just some of these somewhat minor tweaks could increase production of affordable housing in the state twofold. And it's also, I mean, this is another commentary on sort of federal government dysfunction too, right? Where there's been introduced now for several sessions legislation that is bipartisan at the federal level, and that measure just does not ever even get a vote. That's the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Improvement Act.
There's definitely areas where the federal government can improve. I think one of the conversations that have been had that was part of some of the earlier Biden administration efforts were, making housing vouchers a right rather than sort of a program that's funded through block grants. I think that would be very transformative, and it would allow a lot of affordable housing developers and even the market rate housing industry to anticipate what future revenue might be, and I think it could fund a lot of housing. And I think there needs to be significant funding from the federal level as well. But there's different ways to do this, and I think everybody here supports that.
Yeah, and I think it was a big disappointment that housing was not included in the infrastructure, deal at the federal level, and that really should have been in there. I know there's a great push by advocates, but that was a real missed opportunity, and quite frankly, didn't make a lot of sense to us why it was left out.
Okay, so I will move on since we have 4 more minutes. We have nearly 400 people on this webinar, and 10% of them have asked questions. So the last question I'm gonna ask, and I really wanted to hit insurance questions since that's important right now, but I feel like we really should ask, like, what do you see in housing when it comes to California this upcoming year, and what has been missing in the space that feels like that's a gap that should be filled in?
Yeah, I think there has been, to the point that others have made too, a lot of focus on land use and entitlements and streamlining, and a lot of that work I think has been accomplished, and I think obviously there's going to be a tremendous focus on funding, but I think there's also always going to be need for cleanup, and we'll be talking to Marina too about some potential cleanup ideas for AB 2011, for example, which just went into effect in July. But as folks try to see how to use these bills, and as you know, for many of the past several years, we've also sponsored cleanup to what was SB 35 and hopefully SB 423, and so there'll be lots of need to go ahead and continue to perfect that legislation as be implemented going forward. And obviously the Terner Center research really helps with that kind of work. I think there's lots of interest in impact fee reforms and the way we calculate those fees, and some of the lack of fairness in the way they're applied jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and can be very excessive and limit the kinds of housing that you build and the income levels of households that can live in those communities. And so we'll be looking for that. I think there'll be continued work and engagement with the Coastal Commission, quite frankly, and how density bonus applies in the coastal zone, for example. And I think the ongoing conversations around office to housing conversion, and there was some movement in the legislature and interest in that, and I think we'll continue to see some of that in this next session as well. Also hearing about emphasis on not only affordable home ownership opportunities, but in particular focus on how we can build condos and townhouses in the high cost coastal areas, and there could be a package of reforms based on what's been accomplished in other states. That California's kind of lagged behind on that, and obviously our home ownership rates reflect that. Those are still lots of bill ideas. I think we're hearing about interest in clarifying how the builder's remedy applies after this last housing element cycle, and so those are some of the things that I expect that we'll be seeing introduced in the next year.
I think next year you'll see definitely continue the good work of HCD and our Housing Accountability Unit and the AG stepping in more forcefully and enforcing state housing law. At the legislative front, obviously we'll be back with SB 405. It died because of cost and implementation with HCD, but we'll be back looking at how to reform the RENA process and housing elements overall. And you'll see some minor, just kind of building code type bills from us. We have an idea to really look at fire sprinklers. Just a couple years ago, fire sprinklers are mandatory in residential homes, but the hookup costs have been just astronomical. So we're going to be working with the fire prevention officers and others to really run a bill to really make sure those costs are reasonable. And other than that, pushing hard for a school bond on the statewide ballot in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of 2024 is going to be figuring out what that ballot looks like. There's a lot of stuff, not just housing measures, but other measures that I think we've touched on that interact with some of the housing measures as well. And so kind of what does that look like, and how crowded does the ballot get, and to what degree does that actually so for some of the housing measures, like let's say there is a housing bond or a school construction bond, do some of these other things make those harder to pass because of voter confusion or fear of taxes, et cetera. And so I think a lot of 2024 is going to focus on that. A lot of issues that our members have raised, and we're still doing kind of our deep fall dive with our members coming up. But a lot of it tends to be very technical. You know, we've done a lot of these big land use bills. We've cleaned up a lot of stuff that kind of is more flashy in the legislative space. And so a lot of the concern is the implementation. It's Cornelious touched on building codes, like to what degree have building codes actually added so many bells and whistles on development that doesn't really advance housing development much, but is increasing the costs, you know, a lot on the insurance space. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the disappointments this year was, at least from our side, was seeing SB 450 fail, and then seeing sort of the single family areas being excluded from the implementation of SB 684. You know, I think one of the bright spots, I'll say, for affordable housing this year in Los Angeles was Executive Directive 1. And we saw a couple projects, you know, nearly 1,500 units proposed throughout various parts of the city of Los Angeles, where developers, not affordable housing developers, but smart rate developers, were able to propose 100% affordable projects, deed restricted affordable projects, without any public subsidy. And they were able to do that because they were able to build it in single family zones where the land was much cheaper. So I do think if we as a state want to address our housing crisis, address our homelessness crisis, we really need to tackle this problem of single family areas. And sort of, we need to look at that, because I think without doing that, without allowing housing in the places where people want to live, we're going to have a serious challenge, you know, addressing these crises in a meaningful way.
I couldn't agree with that. We were delighted to support 684, and we were just very saddened to see the single family neighborhood aspect removed from the bill. Definitely want to work with the sponsors on getting that bill back next year if it comes back. And, you know, just quite frankly, we're getting a lot of opposition. People are saying, hey, you need to build more infill. Then when we have bills like this, it gets watered down, it's a problem. So if the state wants to promote more infill, they need to find ways to incentivize that, that product type.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Now I'm going to go to audience questions. We got 40. So first, the Turner team, if you could copy and paste all of these questions to a Word document, we could send responses to these questions following the presentation. I will work on that. I always feel bad when we have people join a webinar, have a pressing question, no answer. I'll try to answer as many of these questions as I can with the team here. I might annoy you all a little bit just for a little bit of your time or your feedback for these 40 questions. I feel like it's important. Okay. Wow. Here's one question. Is the panel concerned about the recent move by many carriers to get out of the California residential homeowners market? And do they see any likelihood of the insurance commissioner moving quickly to reform the system to address concerns? So the insurance question came back. How is California insurance issues hindering your housing development? Affordable and
it is.
Yeah, go.
It was the biggest issue of the year. This insurance crisis, biggest issue, pretty much stopped housing development for a lot of our members. You know, interesting enough, the product type that was hardest to insure is condos and multifamily attached products. So it's, once again, the state saying, hey, we want to fill more middle housing type, but the fact that our elected officials did not act as quickly as they could on the insurance prices really forced a lot of people back to single family homes, which is okay. But yes, we're optimistic. We're optimistic the legislature, the governor, and the insurance commissioner could work quickly to address this. We need to bring back insurers into our market. We cannot have insurers leave. If we can't insure homes, we can't have people buying. So that's a huge problem.
Yeah, I mean, we have one of our developer members talked about 1,000% increase on one of their properties. And, you know, with affordable housing, when you have rents are already restricted, it has a real threat to sort of the development community and the owners and managers of the properties, because there's no way to take on that kind of increase to your operating costs long term.
All right, I'll go, unless anyone else has any other thoughts, I'll go to the next question. Okay. Wow, okay. Would be interested in the panel's thoughts on two items: the tension between the Coastal Act, Coastal Commission, and the pro-housing movement, and two, the California Forever project in Solano County, and whether and how to measure your organization's support for a large-scale project that will include both single-family residential and high-density components. So number one, Coastal Act, Coastal Commission, and tension with the pro-housing movement. Number two, that city that's being proposed in Solano, even though there are plenty of cities in that area that would love the increased development and infrastructure. That's my little thing.
I would just say real quick, we've been engaged with the staff at the Coastal Commission and talked through, as you know, they had opposed SB 423, and then we're involved in negotiations during the summer recess on how to work through some of those issues. But obviously, we should not be exempting some of the wealthiest coastal areas from our housing laws, and so that something had to give there. And there was a negotiation, obviously, and it's like any negotiation. These are compromises that are frustrating, and there's more work to do there, I think. But to get to the understanding that, we need to be able to apply these laws across the state. It's only fair to do so. Plus, you've got a workforce over there that's really suffering in terms of the hospitality industry. You have farm workers on the coast and all kinds of various needs for housing. And so I think we've made some movement there. Obviously, Senator Wiener and the advocates were very strong on this, and congratulations to you to really push that issue. And I think it's forced us to engage how we think about the coastal zone. It's also come up, by the way, with parking requirements of various kinds, and how are we going to be auto-centric in our thoughts about how we access the coast. And in the context of climate change, I think we have to revisit all of those previous understandings about what it means to protect our coast, which we all want to do, but we also need a balanced approach to be able to provide the housing. And so those conversations are going to continue. But I think the real impetus really was around, I think, the density bonus bill that Assemblyman Alvarez had, and some of the delegation from San Diego, which is affected most in terms of an urban area. And how much of the coastal zone takes up the city of San Diego, and obviously SB 423. So more to follow on that, but I think we want to lower the rhetoric on it and really engage in a very, I think, systematic way, in a professional way. And it came down to the maps and what sea level rise looks like, and coastal erosion, and all those very technical issues that we need to be able to address in a professional way. And I think I'm really pleased at the progress that's been made.
I think that on sort of the coastal zone challenge, and I mean, it extends broader than that, is just the amount of subjectivity that housing gets at all levels of approval. And so the more objective standards that we can get, and if we could get the Coastal Commission process to be more objective, with timelines, right? Like, those are the kinds of things that will be meaningful, where it's not just like taking away all the control, but to make sure that it is objective in its very nature.
I think we're sort of creating these streamlined process for affordable housing, for mixed income housing throughout the state. We can't exclude some of the richest areas of the state from being part of this process. We need objective standards that don't require discretionary processes to build housing everywhere in the state, including in the wealthiest coastal areas.
And no one wants to comment on the city.
I want to talk. I'll just briefly talk about Solano County, and I think you get proposals like that when you make it so hard to build infill housing. That's my frustration, is that we actually have infill exemptions on the books for housing that people still fight tooth and nail, or they say students are noise pollution at UC Berkeley, and yet they're up in arms. And when you get a proposal like this, well, I mean, something has to give. Where was the engagement with some kind of a grand bargain, which we really needed, where we would say, hey, infill housing, we're going to make that streamline and make it work. And yet there's been so much resistance to that in every bill that we've tried to pass. We've done over major opposition, and oftentimes from environmental groups. And then everyone's shocked and awed, and amazed when you get a proposal like that. It doesn't add up.
I just echo those comments. And listen, we're in a housing crisis, so housing production anywhere in our state is good. So yeah.
Well, and I think one of the questions someone was asking was about third rail issues and related to housing, and it's like almost everything that's housing related has third rail components to it. And it's partly why I think we don't see, even when we have these really big heavy lift bills that are sort of silver bullet, they still end up, in order to get through the political logjam and of Sacramento and California and local politics and you name it, there's always going to be these trade-offs that happen that goes from what you could have really huge progress to much more narrow. And sometimes it's like, it's important, they're important considerations. I'm not saying that we should just like lift everything and let anything happen, but the infill conversation is a really good example of that, right? And we saw this in the battle around SB4. We've seen it in a lot of other bills where if we want to increase infill development, which is a climate change strategy, right? Climate solution. At the same time, we have environmental groups fighting that, and environmental justice groups fighting that, because that's near highways, that's near warehouses, that's near, right? They're near pollutants. I'm like, well, which are we going to have? If we want everything to be infill, but then we don't want anything that's infill to have these other challenges, what are we supposed to do? And some of those conversations, I think, and Cornelious touched on AB 68 earlier, like those are the conversations that really need to be happening. It touches on the Solana, like all of these are related to that.
I will ask maybe one or two more questions. This one I think is best answered by you, Marina. There have been a lot of tensions between housing legislation and the building trades instance of skilled and trade workforce language. This was partly addressed with AB 2011, which had an alternative approach to labor standards. But how do you see this issue playing out in the future? That's open to everyone, but Marina first.
Yeah, I mean, we, for many years, I feel like we were kind of like the only ones with some of our other affordable housing colleagues opposing a lot of the skilled and trained workforce requirement language, because we knew that was a real barrier to development. We made some headway with AB 2011. Now SB 423 replicated that. AB 1449 replicates those labor standards. So does SB 4. So, I'm hopeful that we can kind of get past that, having labor fights on every bill, and I'm hopeful we can move forward with more meaningful legislation that doesn't get bogged down with those battles. I do think prevailing wage probably needs some reforms to make it more workable throughout in all corners of the state, and maybe with some of those reforms you can get sort of more buy-in from BIA and others too, and so I guess my answer is I'm hopeful. And we'll see how also these standards work. Like some of the aspects of these standards are new, and we need to see kind of how the construction industry can respond to them too.
I just want to say, I want to thank the carpenters and the operating engineers and the laborers for their amazing work and for the support of SB4 and SB 423. It takes a lot of leadership to come out and support these bills and make affordable housing, mixed income housing possible. So we're really happy to work with them. And we're hopeful that, we saw that we did come to an agreement on 423 and SB4 with the Building Trades Association as well. So I'm optimistic that we'll be able to sort of continue to build housing in California, make sure folks are paid high wages, that their rights are protected, and move forward together.
And I think I could sneak in one more question before we end. And this is from a legislative staffer. So what are the roadblocks of putting together a coalition like the Costa Compact again for housing streamlining and funding priorities?
Well, I think that's really what we're trying to do in part with our California Home Building Alliance. I was actually part of the previous Costa Compact. As you know, it's really hard to keep all the groups together. Not everyone is pro housing production. There are supply skeptics out there that really don't think supply and demand has a role to play. But I'm certainly open to revisiting some of those discussions, particularly with those who are particularly focused on rent stabilization, that kind of thing, which is a thorny issue. But we did that with AB 1482 and actually brought the business community behind that. But it also means that we have trade-offs and we need support for our pro-production. But we've got affordable housing developers involved in our coalition and other affordable housing advocates as well. And so it's really those who are on the tenant side, we'll continue to extend our hand to them to try to see if they can work with us, particularly on maybe the funding measures that are going forward, and other areas where there's common interest and where we can work together.
That concludes our discussion. That concludes our webinar. Thank you so much to all the panelists for coming here and speaking on legislation that hasn't been signed yet, but hopefully they will all be signed. And thank you so much for everyone for attending this event. We will follow up to all of the questions put within the Q&A in the next week or two. It's conference season, so it's a little busy, but I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining this webinar, and thank you for all of you for participating and joining us here today.
Thank you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.